Another extraordinary day in New Zealand politics. We will be crossing soon to Simon Bridges, we'll be going to him live. He's giving a press conference momentarily. In the meantime, we're going to get a bit of an analysis on this with our political editor, Jane Patterson. Good evening to you, Jane.
Good evening, Alex.
You would have watched that press conference where our colleagues were peppering Jami-Lee Ross with questions, and then you would have listened, like we all did, to that recorded phone conversation. We all got the impression in the press conference that it was clear that there was not going to be evidence in the phone conversation of Simon Bridges explicitly instructing Jami-Lee Ross to split up the donation. Do you think Jami-Lee Ross has overplayed his hand here?
Look, I think his comments today definitely walked back a bit from the evidence that he was claiming to be presenting today. And as you say, in that audio recording, there is no smoking gun, there is no specific order from Simon Bridges to split the donation or anything about specifically committing any electoral fraud, which of course Simon Bridges continues to deny. But I think what we did here is a conversation that sounds at the least shifty. The two men discussing a donation. I think it is notable that Simon Bridges acknowledges a $100,000 donation, so the fact that it was there and that it was related to the businessman that Jami-Lee Ross did mention also in the phone call. Now, the other thing too is we have checked with the Electoral Commission today, and anything over $30,000 has to be declared in 10 working days. There are no donations in the name of Mr. Zhang that have been declared by the National Party this year. There are no donations of $100,000, and of course that was well past 10 working days ago. So if they were talking about a donation, that has not turned up in the National Party return, so that is a question. But as I said, no specific, very direct comments about splitting it up or circumventing the Electoral Act.
Now, where we're going to go next is I think the parties involved here are going to say this is under a police investigation and we can't talk anymore. And until we get to there, though, there's a lot of moving parts and things are still being updated. Jami-Lee Ross also made mention of text messages that he had with Greg Hamilton and he was going to release them. We haven't seen them yet this evening, have we?
No, we haven't. So those text messages relate to queries that the party secretary, Greg Hamilton, and that is the person in whose name the returns are filed. So he effectively signs off those electoral returns for the National Party. Now, he came back to Jami-Lee Ross because this is what Jami-Lee Ross said in the stand-up, was that when he was given, when he received the donations, he then received 10 different names or a handful of different names and addresses that he suggested would then be put through the National Party too. Now, Greg Hamilton queried those names, where they came from, and basically how they sort of fitted into the return. Now, Jami-Lee Ross said that he has texts of those recordings or copies of those texts with Mr. Hamilton, and he says that's further evidence that there was something hinky about the donation and the way that it had been handled. We do not yet have copies of those texts.
And Greg Hamilton, as the secretary of the party, was the person I think that Paula Bennett mentioned this morning that should have been the person that this whole matter should be referred to as in a sense, the representative of the party who receives the donation. But also Party President Peter Goodfellow has been mentioned here because he was mentioned in that recorded conversation between Jami-Lee Ross and Simon Bridges. What role do you think he plays, and do you think he's going to speak?
Well, look, there is nothing to suggest wrongdoing on either of their party officials. Now, they have so far just issued a statement yesterday as in the roles of representatives of the party rather than the parliamentary wing. But the point that their involvement is that all money should really go through the party president and the party side of it. And we've seen this in other expenses, controversies in the past, that basically if MPs directly take a cheque from a donor, then there might be an expectation of a quid pro quo, that the MP or the party leader knows that Mr X or Mrs X gave them the money and therefore they might get a favour in return. So the whole point is to put up a wall between donations and fundraising, which of course MPs do, but when the money starts to come in, the accepted process is that it goes to the party president and or the party secretary, and that there's that divide. So that's why Peter Goodfellow and Greg Hamilton have been talked about in this story, because they are the ones that would normally deal with the money. And as I said, Greg Hamilton is the one whose name is on that electoral return, and he signs off that everything is well and good and complies with the law.
Now, if we go to the next stage of the conversation that was recorded, they move on, of course, to basically possible new blood, newcomers, new list MPs at the next election for National Party. And then, of course, who might go. And this is, I guess, something that we didn't expect at all, was Simon Bridges being so candid about what he thought about some of his colleagues. He's been telling us in the last few days he has a very united caucus. I suppose it's very, very clear the tape shows otherwise.
Well, showed a leader talking about MPs that he thought would be natural candidates for retirement soon, and that was Chris Finlayson and David Carter. Now, there wasn't necessarily any aspersion on their competence. It was just that coming to the end of their careers, they'd both been ministers, and they would be people that would be expected, and as we have talked about, that would move off the list and leave Parliament. But then he said about other MPs that are just effing useless, naming List MP Maureen Pugh in particular, and he said there were a handful of others that he'd basically just like to see leave. Now, on Twitter, he said that he had apologised to Maureen Pugh and that she had accepted, but I think the most extraordinary, to use that word again, part of that conversation was the way that him and Jami-Lee Ross casually and dismissively discussed the merits of having Chinese versus Indian MPs or candidates, and that was related to basically the money that they could bring in if they were given a place in the caucus. Now, the National Party has very, very good support from those ethnic communities, from the Chinese and the Indian community and other ethnic groups and constituents. And I imagine it would cause a great deal of consternation among those communities to hear the way that the donations were viewed and the people that represent those constituents in the National Party had been discussed by Simon Bridges and Jami-Lee Ross.
Well, that's exactly as you describe it, in the sense, if you're looking at the tail end of the National Party list at the moment, and of course there's been movement because people have moved on. Maureen Pugh herself, I think, has come in subsequent terms as a result of resignations, I think, from Bill English and then Tim Grosser, or the other way around. But you've got people that represent ethnic groups there. I think the next two people to come in is Agnes Loheni in South Auckland, who represents specific people. You've got Paulo Garcia, who ran against Deborah Russell, I should say, in Auckland as well. So, in a sense, how did those people react to this tape and the communities that they represent when they hear, I guess, what could be described as such cynical calculations?
Well, the National Party talks a lot about merit. They have criticised Labor in the past for pandering to interest groups, to pandering to unions or different ethnic groups or gender groups. They have said, MPs should be there on merit. They should be there for the contribution to the party. Now, that conversation with Simon Bridges and Jami-Lee Ross would reflect a view that actually there's a financial aspect to the selection of candidates, and suggesting really that people are there because of their ethnicity in some cases, rather than the contribution that could be made to the party. And as I said, I imagine that would cause a great deal of upset in those communities. As I said, many of them have been long and strong supporters of the National Party.
Finally, Jane, before you go, can Simon Bridges recover from this? It's the question that's been asked again and again in the last few days. This is another very serious blow to his credibility. He was very quick to come out on Twitter and apologise and said he's spoken to Maureen Pugh. Is there just too much now for him to recover from?
This is going to cause him major problems, and we're just about to cross, as you said, live to Simon Bridges to see how he is going to justify that phone conversation. And the effect of it is that there has been blow after blow after blow, all, of course, delivered by Jami-Lee Ross. Now, let's not dress this up. The strategy of Jami-Lee Ross is to take Simon Bridges down, even as Mr. Ross's own political career has clearly gone up in smoke. Mr. Bridges is an incredibly fragile spot at the moment. It'd be very interesting to see how he describes it, but I have seen few political leaders that have come under such heavy attack and that have survived those attacks in the likes that Simon Bridges has come under in the last 2 days.
Okay, thank you very much for your analysis, extended analysis on this breaking and ongoing news story. Jane Patterson there, our political reporter.